All right. So, um, we have finished up talking about the Bible stories and how all those point to Jesus, and we are shifting to another sub series of our main series, all about Jesus, where we are going to be talking about how the law, the feast days, the sacrificial system, how each of those point to Jesus as well. And how all just adding to this idea that all of Scripture points to Jesus. And so it is that we're going to be in this series for a few weeks, and so we're really going to be just jumping into that. And I really, it's unfortunate because when you get to Leviticus, when you get to the law, specifically Leviticus, it's where a lot of people stop reading the Bible. It's where you hit that, you're reading the Bible through in a year and you hit Leviticus, and if you make it through Leviticus, then you get hit by Numbers, and it's just kind of this rough period of time in the Bible where it makes it so hard to get through. It's so hard to understand, and it's sometimes messy and gross. It's uh, very boring at times. It seems so outdated. There's so many rules and they don't make sense. And there's so much that's going on in the book of Leviticus that we miss because of this. The book of Leviticus and the law in general, the law books in general, are packed full of symbolism and depth to them. They are some of the most symbolic books of the Bible. And we miss it because they're so hard to read, unfortunately. And so that's sad on one hand, but I myself have fallen prey to that. Like I get to Leviticus and I'm like, oh, it's Leviticus. Just kind of gotta push on through it and get to the other side. Just it's like slogging through mud. And so it's so difficult. And I felt that myself as well. But in the end, it is actually so jam-packed with symbolism, and that's really what we're going to be looking at in this section of the series. So hopefully what this will do is this will actually help you understand some of those sections better, like the parts where you're like, man, I just don't get this. Hopefully this will help with that some. And so before we really jump in, just give you somewhat of an introduction to the book of Leviticus here. Like the book of Leviticus picks up where Exodus ends. So Exodus ends with the tabernacle being filled with the presence of God. The presence of God descends on the tabernacle, and it's so magnificent, so glorious that nobody, not even Moses, can enter into the presence of God. And that's how the book ends. That it is just this magnificent moment of God's presence descending down among his people, but nobody can draw close to him at all. Um, and so that's where Leviticus picks up. And what Leviticus is a basically a law book, a rule book, a manual for how is it that you can be in the presence of God. So we end in Exodus where they can't even get close to God. And Leviticus is like, hey, you should want to be near God. So here's how you do it. And that's really what the law is covering, what Leviticus, where Leviticus picks up. And um, and so it's this manual for the Israelites on how is it that you can actually live in the presence of God, not just this God was dwelled in the center of their camp. So how can they live with God's presence there among them? And so um, you see when you read it, one of the things that can be tempting to do is think of like what was so you see God is we're told that God is so holy that anybody who has sin is sinful can't even be in his presence. This is why none of them are able to come to him. And so it could be easy to think of it as, well, God is just vengefully killing anybody who would dare enter his presence with sin. But that's not at all what it is. It's very different. And I really like how a group called the Spoken Gospel, how they used an illustration that I think just really explained it well. So we're going to talk about that illustration, and that is, think of the sun. The sun, that's at the center of our solar system. Uh, think of that. What is the sun? Well, it's the thing that all the planets revolve around. It provides warmth. It creates the rotation of the Earth, which it is that without the warmth of the sun, we would all freeze. It also provides the nutrients that we need to survive. It provides the light that plants need to grow, and without plants, then we can't have food. And it provides, but if it was too hot or we were too close, we'd burn up. And so the sun is so important for us for life. It's crucial to our life. And so, what would happen if the sun just suddenly went out one day? Well, the Earth would be, we would all die. That's as simple as it gets. We'd all die. Um, but what also would happen if you decided, okay, I'm going to go on a trip to the sun and I'm going to land on the sun? What would happen to you if you somehow headed to the sun and got there and landed on the sun? Well, first of all, you probably couldn't even get close to the sun because the sun, well, you'd burn up. It's so powerful, it's so strong and hot that to even get close to it, it would kill you. But the fact that it would kill you when you get close to it, does that actually make the sun a bad thing? No, it doesn't make it a bad thing at all. It just means that it's powerful, it's hot. But it does provide life when in the correct context. We just can't come close to it. And so um, this is kind of like God's holiness. Because of our sin, God is so holy, so perfect, so powerful, that he is not vengefully killing people who would dare enter his presence. He is actually, we just simply would die by coming into his presence because we're unable to withstand that, just like you would be unable to withstand the heat and fire of the sun and the radiation of the sun, like you would die. And it's the same thing for God. It doesn't make God bad, it doesn't make him vengeful. It just means that you can't withstand the sun. And so another thing is imagine then that NASA somehow was able to build a spaceship that could actually go to the sun and you'd be protected. So imagine that they somehow did manage to build this and that you could go and you could land on the sun, you wouldn't die, you'd be perfectly protected. That spaceship would provide the covering that you needed to be shielded from the heat and radiation of the sun. And so you would be able to survive if they were able to theoretically build this kind of spaceship. And that is the concept of atonement. So, atonement is the covering of sin that pays the price of sin for you, and it covers you so that you can enter into God's presence without dying. You are covered and protected from the holiness of God, protected from your own sin that would kill you in the presence of God uh, by the atonement. And so spaceship is very much like atonement. Imagine if NASA had built the spaceship that allowed you to go into the presence of the sun. That would act the same way as this atonement. And so the book of Leviticus and the law of God is like the blueprints for that spaceship. It's very technical. It shows exactly how the spaceship works. But it is very much like the manual, those blueprints for that spaceship. But the problem is that the law only sort of worked. It was temporary. It constantly had to be done. We'll talk about this further on in the lesson, but we had this problem. And so it was like if NASA built this spaceship, but it only made it to Venus. Well, sure, it's a lot closer to the sun. You were able to get a lot further than we'd ever gone before. You were certainly able to be closer to the presence of the sun, but it wasn't perfect. It didn't fulfill its role. And so what Jesus did when he came was he built the spaceship 2.0 and his worked. And with his, you could go be in the presence of God permanently. You could go live on the sun with this spaceship. And so then the question, is if that's the case, why bother reading Leviticus and the law? Why, if it didn't work, why even bother with it? Why not just spend our time in the New Testament where it talks about Jesus and his sacrifice? Paul talks about it, Peter talks about it, the authors of the New Testament, they all talk about it. We can read about it in the Gospels. Why not just focus on that? Well, the reason is because the New Testament authors expect you to have a working knowledge of the law in order to understand what they're talking about. You see, the second spaceship was built by improving on the first spaceship's design. And so, in order to understand the second, you have to understand the first if you're going to understand how the second works. And so, Leviticus explains why Jesus' death on the cross worked. And so, it is what explains the how salvation works to us. And so, in order to understand why Jesus' death on the cross works, you have to actually understand the law of Leviticus, this technical stuff, because they're modeled after the same thing. Atonement is still atonement, whether it's in Jesus' day or it's um, in Moses' day. And so this is why Leviticus is important. Now, second problem that we can run into when we read Leviticus is that we can wonder why God has made it so difficult to be in his presence. Why did he have to make it difficult? Like there's so many rules, there's so many laws. Why is it so tough to be in God's presence? Couldn't God, he's all powerful, couldn't he have made it more like simpler for man to actually be in his presence? And so it can be easy to kind of almost vilify God, like he's using the rules to almost protect himself from you, like giving you all these hurdles that you have to jump through just to be in his presence. But again, this is a misunderstanding of the book of Leviticus. The rules weren't there for God. The rules were there for man. And so God didn't need atonement. Man did. It was man who needed those rules. Now, most religions actually in that day that had a sacrificial system, they didn't have a law book like Leviticus. Most cultures that practiced sacrifice to their gods didn't have the rules laid out as clearly as Leviticus and the rest of the law in Deuteronomy and parts of Exodus, as clearly as they all lay it out. What they had to do is they had to sacrifice something and hope their God accepted it. They didn't know. They had no clue if he was going to accept it, and if they felt like he didn't, well, then they had to try something else. And their life was on the line. Like if you didn't appease the gods, your plants didn't grow, and so you died. And so the stakes were high. The stakes were very, very high, and yet there were no rules. You just kind of had to figure it out. And so the Jewish law is very different in that God, the Jewish God Yahweh, actually gave them a rule book to have. And so rules aren't a bad thing. The fact that there are so many rules is not necessarily a bad thing. What it does is it's actually God's grace to man to give them the rules. They get the rules to know how to come and be in the presence of God. And so imagine if we were to play a game and I told you uh, that you set you up in two teams and there was two tables, and on one of the tables or on both tables was a stack of red Solo cups. And imagine I told you, split you into the teams, and all I said was, all right, go. Don't break the rules or you're out. Let the games begin. And that's all I said. Well, you wouldn't know what to do. You wouldn't know how to win the game. You wouldn't know how to compete in the game. And if you tried to do anything and it happened to be wrong, well, I'd tell you were out of the game and you'd be out of the game. That's no fun for anybody. That's impossible. It's miserable to play. So then I said, well, okay, well, let me give you the objective. Your goal is to stack the cups on the opposite table before the other team. Go. I still didn't give you the rules. I just gave you the objective, but you still don't have the rules, and so you're still going to struggle to do it right. So then what if I said, okay, let me tell you the rules. The rules are that it's a relay race, and you have to take turns with your team. You have to put one of the cups on your head, bounce it all the way over there to the other table, and then remove it without having it fall off your head, set it on the table, and stack one cup, and then come back, and then tag your partner, and your partner's going to go and do the same thing. And you're your first person to get a cup pyramid all the way stacked up. They're the ones that win. And the second, and that's the rules. Well, that's much easier to play. Even if there are nitpicky rules, even if it's a difficult game to play, now you have rules you can follow. And so the rules were never for me. I never had to have the rules. I wasn't playing the game. But for you to succeed at the game, I had to give you rules. And so rules aren't a bad thing at all. And so when we look at Leviticus and think of them as this massive rule book that's impossible to follow, well, that's the book of that's the book of Leviticus. And but it's not a bad thing. Those rules aren't a bad thing, especially when you take into account the fact that other cultures didn't have those rules. Other cultures struggled to have anything. They were simply they were just going to struggle to even succeed to appease their gods. And so these rules, all these rules, are not for God. They are His grace to man. So that's really what we need to have in our minds as we come into the book of Leviticus. And so we are going to jump into just this video, and I mentioned Spoken Gospel. This is a video that they did that I think introduces the book of Leviticus and the law and how it points to Jesus. Because that's the other thing about Leviticus, is that it points to Jesus every step of the way. And so what I really want to do is focus on why is it that Leviticus, why are we going to talk about all of this? And then we'll talk about the burnt offering. So just let's jump into the video.
How can we live in God's presence? Well, the answer is given to us in the book of Leviticus. For just before it, in the book of Exodus, we see Moses trying to enter God's presence. For God had just filled this newly constructed tabernacle with His glorious luminescence. But a problem develops for Moses, which still exists for us today. We cannot enter in to God's space. And the reason we can't enter in is because of who we are and who He is. Because God is perfection and we are sin. It's the same reason why darkness can't exist within light, because that which is dark cannot remain next to that which is bright. So, if we are ever to dwell with God, we must become like light. Or, as the book of Leviticus will tell us, the only way to live with God closely is to be holy as He is holy. But how can we? With all our sin and everything that's broken, how will our darkness be able to enter His presence for even one moment? Well, the book of Leviticus provides us with the answer, and it's through something called atonement. Atonement is the price that has to be paid to make humans and God alike. So God graciously provided a system through priests and sacrifice to take His people's darkness and replace it with light. Atonement allowed the Israelites to transfer their darkness onto an offering God had specified. And since the cost of sin is the loss of life, that atoning offering had to die. But that only removed the penalty of darkness. It did not create any light, which is why sacrifice is only part of the story atonement has to tell. The other part is that God made a way to turn His people into light as well. That's what Leviticus calls purification, the taking of the dark and making it bright with God's holy illumination. It's taking the innocence of the sacrifice and granting it to another in an act of gracious application. And that's what God gave the nation of Israel, a way for them to be light like Him and live near His presence in the temple. That's why this system was essential. That's why atonement was necessary. But the problem was, the effects of this ceremonial system were only temporary. For like all of us, The people who lived in the time of Leviticus did not sin just once, but constantly. So they did not need atonement one time, but repeatedly. They could not stop becoming darkness and deserving its penalty. They could not stop becoming unlike God and needing new purity. Which is why the priests had to stand at the altar daily to make atonement for the people unceasingly. That's why Leviticus is filled with so many sacrifices and offerings. But no matter the offering, again and again, with great care and expense, the priests stood on behalf of the condemned to take their darkness, make it light, and intercede for them. So when we read in Leviticus about goat livers and dove wings, fine flour and kidneys, what we really need to see is just how much it takes to make atonement for our wrongs so we might be right. We need to see how much it costs to take our stains and make them white. We need to see that something has to die to take our darkness and make us light. But above all, we must remember the point of all of this is to make a way for us to live in God's presence. Which is why one day described in Leviticus outshines all of this meticulous maintenance, and it becomes the book's main focus. And the name for this day, the name for this moment, is the Day of Atonement. For on this day, God provided a way for just one priest, just once a year, to enter his presence, make amends for sin, and allow all God's people to be cleansed. But this priest was not truly light. He had to make his own sacrifice to briefly be allowed to enter God's might. So this was not a permanent condition, but a momentary glimpse. This was not the end of the story, but where it begins. For if humans living outside God's light are ever to be brought within, we are going to need a better priest, one who is without sin, one who doesn't have to purify himself to enter the tent, but who is already light itself and can bring us with him, which is why what Leviticus depicts is not a finished system. Instead, it points to something else in the distance, to a day God had chosen, the day when God would complete everything Leviticus put in motion. It points us to another day, a final day of atonement. For the light in the temple, the very presence of God, did not stay in heaven, but became flesh and blood. And this God in the flesh, this blood from the Father, put his own life and light on the last and final altar. The final day of atonement is in Jesus' cross. It fulfills everything Leviticus taught and every sacrifice found within. But no longer would sinners bring their offering to God, for God would be the offering for them. And so, he who is light itself took on our darkness and died for our sins. But then, Jesus did something even better than the priest did on the Day of Atonement. Jesus brought God's light out to those who before could never even approach it. Which is why Leviticus shows us that through atonement we get to live with God. For Jesus has made us into holy light, like he is too. And the most astonishing part of this good news is that the light of God's presence actually comes to dwell in you.
And so it is with this in mind that we take a look at the book of Leviticus and at the law. This is the purpose of it. It's to point you to Jesus. Every complicated and confusing word has a deeper symbolism that points to Jesus. And so hopefully, through this new section of our series, you will be able to track with and understand how it is that this points to Jesus.